I'm Christopher Fisher, and I'm just wanting to put down a few memories from the last 20 years of knife making. So, here is the very first knife I ever made. It's made out of a file with aluminum handle. You notice there's two kinds of rivets in the handle, and the sheath. This is actually the second sheath I made for it, because the first one was made out of really stretchy leather and didn't work out too well. So, where did I get started and why did I get into knife making? Well, it's kind of a long story, but I got started with living in the country, working in gardening and outdoors, running the hills, and I developed quite an interest in primitive survival skills. And of course, the basic concept there is to be able to supply your necessities with your own labor based on whatever nature provides. So your shelter, your food, your clothing, everything, for an indefinite period of time. It's hard work, but it gives a sense of freedom that nothing but that level of self-reliance can bring. And as a young person, that was quite attractive. So one time I was at some meetings where there was a wilderness instructor, and he had a Bussey Battle Mistress collector's grade knife there, and I was just impressed by the simplicity of that knife and its ruggedness, and figured it would be good to try making something of the sort, even though I didn't think I could probably do everything as well as he could. But that kind of started me off in the direction of making my own knives. So this was the first one. Partway through the process of making this knife, my dad bought me a book called Custom Knife Making by Tim McCrate. And one thing he brings out in that book is how to make peened rivets by drilling a hole through material and then flaring the ends of the pin out on both sides. So that's the second type of rivet. The first rivets on this knife are, I believe, 832 panhead screws, which I countersunk. And it's actually threaded into the scale on the far side. So then you'll see here on the photos some pictures of the second knife I made. It was my first knife. After reading that book, I got some ATS 34 steel. So it's my first knife actually using a stainless steel, and it's the only stainless steel knife I've actually heat treated myself. I did it with a torch and seemed to have gotten it hardened and tried to temper it. I'm not sure how well it worked, but it was hard enough to be functional. So it's my first time soldering a brass guard onto a knife, and then it was also the first knife I sold. A friend bought it and took it to the fair and entered it in my name, and of course came away with a blue ribbon because there was no competition. So that was kind of interesting. And knife number 3. This was the first professionally heat-treated knife, and It was a little while before it was finished because I was waiting to get everything back from heat treat and get it all polished up and everything. So it's like the 8th knife I finished, even though it was serial number 3. That one was also my first hollow ground blade. I ground it before heat treat and after, which, like Loveless did. Well, that was the other thing on knife number 2. It was during the process of making that someone loaned me Loveless's video on custom knife making. So I was able to pick up a whole bunch of things off that video. And you see that reflected in knife number 2 and knife number 3 and everything thereafter. Knife number 4. I made it from a small file. I annealed it, ground it, hardened it, tempered it, and reground it, which by my current methods would be very redundant and slow, but it took a while to get past that part of the learning curve. And it was the second knife I sold. Both those first knives went for $35, I believe, which was enough to help buy some grinding belts and other things. And it fit very nicely in my friend's toddler's hand. It was a very compact little knife. Had a nice feel to it. The handle on that was actually made out of a piece of mop handle, if I remember correctly. I just split it in half and drilled and pinned and put it all together. Knife number 5 was my first 6-inch blade, and it's pretty much the predecessor of my current 6-inch full-tang model that you'll find in my brochure and on the website. Although the model I make now is definitely improved over that first one. It was made from a file, again with a redundant heat treating grinding process. You'll notice a little bit of droop to the blade. That's from heat treating it after it was ground. And it's also the first knife that I used the bolts on the handle with the round nuts. Kind of a Loveless style bolt, but different than what he used on the video. But it works very well, it's simple, and I like it. Still use it on probably the majority of my knives. And knife number 6 was my first attempt at a stick tang knife. Through tang, the hole drilled through the handle material, and the first cross draw sheath. Now the sheath had some issues because the guard on that knife was so wide, the blade was so short, and the shoulder on the pouch type sheath was so abrupt that eventually the blade got pushed right through the shoulder where it rested, where the guard rests against the leather. So it ruined the sheath, but it's a good learning experience. I learned that the guards need to be smoothed in a little more so that they prevent that problem. The other thing that was interesting is I tried using some really hard, sticky, probably 300 series stainless steel on the butt cap, and drilling and tapping that to go on the tang was a real chore. Again, that knife was made from a file. And knife number 9 was one that I was grinding, again before heat treat, and I kind of gouged the spine a bit, so I was ready to just throw it out. And Dad said, no, go ahead and heat treat it. So he says, I'll pay for it. So we sent it off to D. Holder along with the other blades to be heat treated. Got it back, put some rather blocky micarta handles on it, and Dad carried that knife for several years, probably about probably 4 or 5 years. It was 1/8 inch thick steel, fairly wide blade, full V grind, and he'd throw it at things and stick in and vibrate, stick in a tree or whatever. Never did break, but he did lose it after a few years. So I made 2 sheaths for it. First one wore out, so I made another one. The next pictures, you'll see several knives. One of them has the back end of a 223 cartridge embedded in the handle. So that was my first inlay of sorts. And that knife sold to a local resident that bought several of my knives and had me make a number of sheaths. Then in the picture there's some others also. A bigger one and a smaller one. The big one in the picture was the most hefty of the knives I've made so far. It's made out of 1/4 inch thick ATS 34 if I remember right. But it was a heavy knife, and the next picture will show the sheath for that knife with its pouch that could hold a stone and a magnesium block, diamond stone for sharpening, magnesium block for fire starting. Next knife is made out of saw blade. I heat treated it myself. I think I got it tempered a little bit on the soft side, but it still worked. I ended up giving it to my sister, and she carried it for years, but I think it burned up when their house burned down. So I think that one is no longer with us. But it was the predecessor of my current bushcraft knife model, which is still made out of saw blade. So it's been a good piece of experience along the way. The handle on that was made out of maple, but I've gone back to a little thicker shoulder on the front because I find if I round it back nicely, I can usually not have too much abruptness down there and still have a more bearing surface for hard slicing, cutting. It reduces hand fatigue to have enough surface area to push on. And knife number 16 was a stick tang with Coca-Cola wood for the handle. That was my first experience with Coca-Cola, and I was really well impressed. If I remember right, Mike Givens, who had worked with Bob Lovelace, gave me that block of wood. And I was able to use it, and turned out to be a really pretty knife. The next picture you'll see is a large mortise tang knife with my micarta handle and a Kydex sheath. So it was one of my earlier Kydex sheaths. The blade was 5/32 thick stainless, 154 cm. So it was a fairly thin, light knife for its size compared to many that I made out of the thicker steels. But I sold it to a local fisherman who wanted it for cutting up salmon. So, well, actually, he wasn't a local fisherman, but he was fishing in our front yard. We were right along the Salmon River there, and he'd go out on the beach and fish. The next picture is my first forged knife, which I still have. It's right here. So I hammered it out of a piece of rebar and did a little grinding to smooth the blade up, heat treated it, and it's actually a pretty functional little cutting tool. So that was a success. Then you'll see some knives from the 30 and 40 serial number range. So those were done in late 2002, and then knives number 43 through 49. Now this was kind of an interesting batch. I sold the third one from the left with its aqua colored diamond wood handle to my great-grandfather's hunting buddy, who had been hunting with my great-grandfather since he was in the 8th grade, and who lived on the hill about a half a mile above us. But he liked that knife. He's passed away since then, but he got a lot of use out of it. And also one of the 6-inch black-handled knives in that picture I started carrying about that time, just before we moved. And I carried that until 2005 when I replaced that knife with another one, another 6-inch full tang. But it was made out of the A2 steel, and it seemed that A2 steel running at 59.5 Rockwell was just too hard for a lot of the chopping tasks I was doing. If you'd hit a knot or people would try to chop bone with it, it would definitely chip. But I chipped mine on knots also. So I think it would be better run a little bit softer. So I haven't used a whole lot of A2 since then. I've used some, but it needs to be a little less in my opinion for the kinds of things I use a heavy chopping knife for. It needs to be a little softer than 59.5 Rockwell. The next picture is knife number 53. And that was the first knife that I made, that I finished here in Elk City. I'd started the blade down on the river and brought it up here and finished it. So that kind of covers what you might call the early days of my knife making. And since we've been here at Elk City, I've made quite a few more knives. 2003 I didn't get started until after the move. I didn't get started until winter. Summer was just too busy getting settled in. And in 2004 I got sick, so I didn't make a whole lot then either. But aside from that, I'd say we've averaged somewhere between 30 and 50 knives a year. But before we sign off, I do have a few of my up-to-date knives, so we can compare a little bit of the difference between knife number 1 and some of my more current stuff. So here's knife number 1. And here's another knife. So this is a 5-inch hidden tang, mortise tang, green canvas, brass guard, a blued blade. This knife is 1075 carbon steel, and it has a pouch type sheath, which there's no retainers that get left unsnapped or something, allowing the knife to fall out. But with the locking cam that I learned from Bob Loveless, just snap that knife in there. It tends to kind of click into place, and then it's quite secure. And getting it to ride the right height on the belt so the handle doesn't stick up too far and gouge you in the ribs, but it doesn't hang too low either. It makes for a lot of comfort in carrying the knife. Here's another little mortise tang, about a 3 5/8 hidden tang Scandinavian ground blade. Aluminum guard, oak handle. and the usual pouch type sheath. Click, pops into place. Here's my 6-inch full tang model. This one has an oak handle also. It's 1084 carbon steel, full V grind, 3/16 thick. This is kind of what I was really looking to make when I first started getting into knife making. It's about as big as I can comfortably carry on a daily basis without getting in the way too much, but it's heavy enough to do a lot of chopping and splitting and slashing and all sorts of survival tasks. And the Nessmuk knife, I read about it, and then I got Nessmuk's book and saw his drawing, and I thought, you know, that has some real versatility to the design, and being an item of historical interest, we'll go ahead and make one like it. So this was my first real push into the saw blade knives as far as producing a lot of them. Here's the sheath. I use a snap retainer on it because with the narrow handle compared to the wide blade, I didn't feel it was safe to have the standard pouch type sheath. I want that shoulder on the sheath so that the knife doesn't over penetrate and come through and hurt somebody. So that's kind of where we've gone. In the future, we're continuing to look to make knives better and faster and cheaper and enough of them so they can go around to all the people who want them. So we look forward to talking to you. Thanks for watching.